she saved his life. He signed the divorce papers without looking up. Nyla Brooks spent 3 years loving a man who believed tenderness was a weakness. 3 years operating on strangers' hearts, while her own bled in silence. And on the exact morning she placed the divorce papers on his desk, that same morning, she was carrying a secret powerful enough to collapse his entire empire. She said nothing. She simply walked out. And that was the most dangerous moment of all. Not because she left, but because he let her go. If you want to know what happens next, hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Stay until the end. Every word matters. The divorce papers were sitting on his desk at 4:47 in the morning. Nyla knew the exact time because she had checked her watch twice before pressing the manila envelope flat against the mahogany surface. Her fingerprints were probably still on it. She didn't care. She had stopped caring about leaving traces in that penthouse a long time ago, back when she realized that nothing she left behind was ever truly noticed. The elevator doors closed behind her without a sound. 63 floors below, Manhattan was still dark. She stood on the sidewalk with one rolling suitcase, a leather carry bag slung over her shoulder, and the particular stillness of a woman who had already cried every tear available to her. There was nothing dramatic about it. No slamming doors, no final speeches delivered to an empty room, just the cold November air pressing against her face and the quiet knowledge that she was done. A cab appeared at the corner. She raised her hand. The driver didn't ask where she'd been. He only asked where she was going. Mount Sinai, she said. Staff entrance. He pulled into traffic without another word, and Nyla stared out the window at the city sliding past. All glass and amber light, and the kind of beautiful indifference that New York did better than anywhere else on earth. Nobody here cared that her marriage had just ended. Nobody would look at her differently on Monday morning. The operating room didn't care about her personal life. That was the only place left that felt like solid ground. She had met Damian Cross at a fundraising dinner for pediatric cardiac research, the kind of event where the food cost more per plate than most people's weekly salary, and nobody actually talked about the children the money was supposed to help. Nyla had been the keynote speaker. She remembered standing at the podium in a deep burgundy dress, looking out at 300 faces that ranged from bored to politely attentive, and delivering the speech she had prepared without once glancing at her notes. Afterward, a man approached her near the bar. He was tall, lean in the way that came from discipline rather than genetics. Dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in a way that somehow looked deliberate rather than careless. He had the kind of face that photographers loved. Sharp jaw, heavy brow, eyes that held information without releasing it. "Dr. Brooks," he said. "That's me." "Your speech was excellent." She had heard that line before. It was always the opening. Your speech was excellent. Then came the pivot, the ask, the pitch, the business card. She waited. But he didn't pivot. He just looked at her with those unreadable eyes and said, "You describe the moment a cardiac surgeon knows a patient is going to survive before the monitors even register it. You said it's a physical sensation, like pressure releasing in the room." She hadn't expected him to remember that part. Most people tuned out the clinical details. "That's accurate," she said carefully. "How do you know the difference between instinct and wishful thinking?" It was a strange question, specific in a way that felt personal rather than intellectual. She studied him for a moment. The set of his shoulders, the controlled stillness of someone who had trained himself not to fidget. "Experience," she said, "and honesty. You have to be willing to know when you're wrong." Something moved behind his eyes. There and gone. "Damian Cross," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm without being performative. She didn't know his name. She should have. Cross Dominion Holdings had been mentioned in Forbes twice that year. But Nyla had never been interested in memorizing the financial landscape of men who ran corporations. She knew hearts, chambers and valves, and the electrical pulses that kept people alive. That was the world she understood. He asked if he could call her. She said she would think about it. He smiled, brief, crooked, more genuine than anything else about him in that moment, and walked away before she could change her mind in either direction. She thought about it for 11 days. Then she called him. The marriage had happened faster than it should have. Looking back, and Nyla had spent considerable time looking back during those final months in the penthouse, She could identify every moment where she should have slowed down, every red flag she had filed under complexity instead of warning. Damien was guarded. She had told herself that was depth. He was emotionally unavailable in ways that felt architectural, like something had been built wrong in the foundation. She had told herself that was history. That given time, given the right environment, given someone patient enough, he had proposed 14 months after their first conversation. She had said yes. Her mother had cried at the wedding. Happy tears, she insisted, though Nyla had caught something uncertain flickering behind them. Her best friend, Camille, had given a toast that was warm and careful, the kind of toast that celebrates without overcommitting. Nobody told her she was making a mistake. Maybe nobody knew. Maybe they all knew and had decided it wasn't their place. Or maybe Nyla had simply made it very difficult to tell her things she didn't want to hear. That was possible too. She had always been better at fixing problems than acknowledging them. The operating room welcomed her back at 6:15 a.m. She scrubbed in methodically, the familiar ritual of it settling something jagged inside her chest. Soap to the wrists, water temperature precise, the specific count of scrub strokes that had become automatic over 12 years of surgical practice. The scrub nurse, a young woman named Priya, who had been working with Nyla for 2 years, glanced up from the instrument tray and then looked again. Dr. Brooks, you're early. Tremblay pushed the Hendricks procedure to 6:30. I checked the board last night. Right, but Priya hesitated. Are you okay? Nyla looked at her. Get me gloves. Size 7. Priya got the gloves. The patient on the table was 61 years old, a retired high school football coach named Gerald Hendricks, who had presented with severe aortic stenosis and a blockage that 3 other surgeons had called inoperable. Nyla had reviewed his imaging on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks earlier, standing at her lightboard in the empty hallway, and had known within 40 seconds that they were wrong. It's not inoperable, she had told Gerald during their consultation. It's difficult. Those aren't the same thing. He had looked at her with the exhausted eyes of a man who had been told no too many times. What are the odds? Better than the alternative, she said. I don't gamble with people's lives, Mr. Hendricks. I assess probability and I eliminate variables. That's different. He had stared at her for a long moment and then laughed. A short, surprise sound. My wife's going to like you. Let's make sure she gets to meet me properly, Nyla said. Book the OR. Now, standing at the table with the overhead lights bleaching everything to clinical white, she felt the familiar compression of the world down to what was essential. The noise of her personal life, the empty penthouse, the signed papers, the 3 years of trying to love someone who had never fully unlocked the door, all of it fell away. Here, there was only the patient, only the work, only the extraordinary, irreducible fact of a human heart that needed help staying alive. She made the first incision at 6:44 a.m. 5 hours and 17 minutes later, Gerald Hendricks had a future. She was eating a sandwich in the surgeon's lounge when her phone lit up. The number was Damien's personal line. Not the office, not his assistant, the private number that fewer than 10 people in the world had access to. She looked at it for 2 full rings, chewing slowly, then set the sandwich down and answered. Damien, the papers. His voice was exactly as she had expected it to be. Level, controlled, like a man reading from a document rather than having a conversation. I found them this morning. I know. We should discuss them. I signed them already, she said. My lawyer's name is at the bottom. Yours can contact her directly. A pause. Not long. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Long enough to be noticeable. That's it? He said. Nyla looked across the lounge at the wall where someone had taped up a faded poster of the human circulatory system. She had stared at that poster through 100 meals and 100 moments of doubt over the years. It had always been easier to look at systems than at feelings. Systems had diagrams. Feelings didn't. I've been patient, Damien. I've been more patient than I probably should have been. She kept her voice even, not cold, just honest. But I need you to hear me. I'm not asking you to fight for something. I'm not waiting for a grand gesture. I am telling you that I made a decision, and I made it clearly, and I would appreciate if you respected it. Another pause. Fine, he said. Just that. Fine. She ended the call and finished her sandwich. What nobody saw What Damien certainly never saw was the notebook. Nyla had started keeping it 8 months into the marriage. Not as a diary exactly, more as a record. A place where she wrote down the things she had done that she knew he would never notice. It wasn't a grievance log. She hadn't started it out of resentment. She had started it because she was, at her core, a scientist, and scientists documented things. They observed. They recorded data. They recognized patterns before those patterns became catastrophic. March 14th, renewed his prescription for the sleep medication. He doesn't know the compound is custom. Off-label combination I developed based on his blood work from last year. Standard prescription wasn't working. I didn't tell him because he would have argued about it. April 2nd, reviewed the Mercer acquisition contracts. Found a clause in Section 7B that would have exposed him to regulatory liability in 3 separate jurisdictions. Sent notes to his attorney anonymously through a colleague. The clause was amended. The deal closed clean. September 9th. He collapsed in the East Wing Library at 11:40 p.m. Arrhythmia. Serious. Managed it myself rather than calling an ambulance because he had briefed me 6 months earlier about what a hospital visit would mean for certain ongoing operations. I don't know all of what those operations are. I didn't ask. I stabilized him, monitored him through the night, confirmed cardiac function by morning. He woke up and asked for coffee. He never mentioned it again. Neither did I. She had filled 43 pages by the time she packed that notebook into her carry bag on the morning she left. She didn't leave it behind. Not because she planned to use it, she had no such intention, and the thought actually made her stomach turn, but because it was hers. It was the only honest record of who she had been inside that marriage. She had earned every word of it. 2 weeks after the divorce papers were filed, Nyla's colleague and oldest friend, Dr. Marcus Webb, took her to dinner at a small Caribbean restaurant in Harlem that had been there since before either of them was born. Marcus was 52, built like a former linebacker, which he was, and had the specific quality of stillness that belonged to people who had seen enough of the world's hardness to stop being surprised by it. He waited until the food arrived before he said anything real. "How bad is it?" "It's fine." "Nyla," she looked up from her rice. "I said it's fine, Marcus. You've said fine 4 times since I picked you up. That's your tell. You only say fine that many times when something is actively on fire." She set her fork down. Outside the window, a bus rolled past, its headlights sweeping briefly across the glass. "I found something," she said carefully, "when I was treating that patient last month, the one who came in under the name Reeves." Marcus went still. He was good at that. The particular stillness of a man paying full attention. What kind of something? Nyla had operated on the man calling himself James Reeves 6 weeks before filing for divorce. He had arrived through a private referral, no hospital records, cash payment arranged in advance through a legal intermediary. She had performed a triple bypass. It was complicated, but not extraordinary. The kind of case she handled regularly. What was extraordinary was what she had found in his medical history. The documentation had been carefully altered, deliberately obscured. But Nyla read medical records the way other people read faces. Instinctively, with attention to what was missing as much as what was present, and what was missing told a story. James Reeves was not James Reeves. The blood work told her things that names could not. Certain genetic markers, a specific pattern of old scar tissue around the heart that matched a type of injury documented in a case she had reviewed years earlier, a case that had passed across her desk during her residency because it was medically unusual enough to be included in a teaching file. The patient in that teaching file had been listed as deceased. His name, before the records were altered, had been Edward Cross, Damien's father. "I operated on a dead man," she said quietly. "Except he wasn't dead. He's been alive for 22 years, Marcus, living under a false identity, and I—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I have been sitting on this for 6 weeks trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, and then Damien—" She didn't finish the sentence. Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose. "Does he know you know?" "No? Does the patient know who you are? That you're connected to—" "I don't think so. The referral was made through intermediaries. He may not have known my name before the surgery. But he does now." "He does now," she confirmed. The restaurant hummed around them. Conversation, music from the kitchen, the sound of a city that never fully quieted. Neela picked up her fork again, though she wasn't hungry anymore. "I'm going to London," she said. Marcus looked at her. "The Whitmore Fellowship. I applied 8 months ago. They offered it last week." She met his eyes. "I need to be somewhere that isn't inside this city when this thing unravels. Because it will unravel, Marcus. Whatever Edward Cross is hiding from his own son, whatever kept a man faking his death for 2 decades, it's not going to stay buried." "And Damien?" She was quiet for a moment. "Damien signed the papers without calling me. He said 2 sentences and hung up." She said it without anger, without bitterness even, just the flat, unadorned fact of it. "Whatever he's owed, and I still believe he's owed the truth about his father, I do. That's a debt I carried long enough." Marcus nodded once, slowly. "When do you leave?" 3 months, maybe 4. She paused. "If nothing forces my hand before then." Outside, a cold rain had begun to fall against the window. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The food got cold. The restaurant gradually emptied around them. And Nyla sat with the weight of what she knew, a secret that could break a man, a marriage that was already broken, and the quiet, terrifying sensation of a woman standing at the edge of her own life, finally ready to choose herself. The problem was that choosing yourself, she was learning, didn't always feel like freedom. Sometimes it felt exactly like falling. 3 days later, in a building 40 blocks south, a man named Damien Cross sat at his mahogany desk long after midnight and opened the manila envelope for the second time. He had already signed it. The ink was dry. But he read through every page again, her signature clean and unhesitating, the attorney's contact information, the division of assets she had requested, which was modest to the point of being almost insulting given what she was entitled to. She had taken almost nothing. He didn't know why that bothered him more than anything else. He set the papers down, poured 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't drink, and stared at the city below him, the same city she had disappeared into, with the uneasy, unfamiliar feeling of a man who had just realized he might have made a mistake so significant it had no obvious remedy. His phone buzzed. A message from his security chief, a man named Rourke, who communicated exclusively in short sentences and never made contact after 11 p.m. unless it was necessary. It said, "We have a problem. Not business. Personal. Need to meet." Damien stared at the message for a long moment. Then he typed back, "Tomorrow, 7 a.m. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did the past. Rourke arrived at 7 a.m. exactly. He always arrived exactly on time. It was one of the things Damien had come to rely on. The man's absolute precision, the way he moved through the world like someone who had long ago decided that unpredictability was a form of weakness. Rourke was 51 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that didn't invite conversation. He had worked for Cross Dominion for 11 years. In that time, Damien had seen him visibly shaken exactly once. He looked shaken now. He sat down across from Damien's desk without being invited, which itself was unusual enough to tighten something in Damien's chest, and placed a thin manila folder on the mahogany surface between them. He didn't push it forward. He just left it there, like something that needed to be approached carefully. "Talk," Damien said. Rourke's jaw worked for a moment. "You need to look at the folder first." "I'm asking you to talk." "Damien." The use of his first name was also unusual. "Look at the folder." Damien looked at it. He didn't reach for it immediately. He had spent enough years running operations where information was a weapon to know that the moment before you received bad news was sometimes the last moment of a certain kind of peace. He was aware this was irrational. He reached for the folder anyway. Inside were photographs. Surveillance quality. Grainy in the way that real surveillance photos always were. Not cinematic, not clean, just the honest ugliness of a long lens capturing something it wasn't supposed to see. The subject was a woman. Dark hair, expensive coat, the particular posture of someone who was accustomed to being looked at and had decided to use it. Damien recognized her immediately. Vanessa Hale. He set the first photograph down and went through the remaining 4 without expression. Vanessa outside the law offices of a firm he recognized, a firm that had represented the political interests opposing his business expansion 3 years ago. Vanessa in conversation with a man whose face Rourke had circled in red pen. Vanessa entering a building in Midtown that Damien knew through layers of corporate structure was connected to the consulting group that had engineered the regulatory crisis that had nearly destroyed Cross Dominion's eastern operations. The crisis that had forced him, through a complicated sequence of political and legal pressure, into an arrangement that had ultimately accelerated his marriage to Nyla. He closed the folder. "How long have you had this?" he said. "The photos go back 8 months. The pattern, the full picture of what they add up to. I've only been certain for about 3 weeks." 3 weeks? "I wanted to be sure before I brought it to you. You know how I work." Damien did know how he worked. Rourke did not speculate. He did not present theories. He presented conclusions, and only after he had eliminated every alternative explanation with the thoroughness of a man who understood that being wrong had consequences. 3 weeks of certainty meant the picture was complete. "She orchestrated it," Damien said. Not a question. The regulatory pressure that forced the Hargrove negotiation. The Hargrove negotiation that produced the political exposure. The political exposure that made the arranged... Rourke stopped, chose his next words with visible care. "The arrangement with Dr. Brooks." "Yes. Vanessa Hale built that sequence. She had help, but the design was hers." The room was very quiet. Outside, 63 floors below, the city was already in full noise. Horns, construction, the relentless grinding machinery of 10 million people moving through their morning. Up here, the triple-pane glass filtered all of it to a faint, almost oceanic murmur. Damien had always found it calming. Right now it felt like the silence inside a held breath. "Why?" he said. Rourke shifted in his chair. "Best reconstruction I have." She expected the arranged marriage to fail quickly. Believed you'd formalize it, satisfy the political necessity, and dissolve it within a year. She positioned herself to be the obvious next step. The stable choice. The one who'd been waiting. She engineered my marriage to make herself look patient. That's the shape of it. Damien stood up. He didn't pace. He never paced. It was a habit he had trained out of himself at 23 because his father had told him that men who paced announced their anxiety to every room they entered. He walked to the window instead and stood with his hands loose at his sides, looking at the city. His father. The man who had told him that. The man who had been dead for 22 years. "There's something else," Rourke said behind him. Damien didn't turn around. "There always is." The patient. The one who came through the private referral 6 weeks before Dr. Brooks filed. The bypass case. Something shifted under Damien's ribs, slow, like tectonic plates. "What about him?" "I've been running background on him for a different reason. He's connected to one of the accounts we flagged last quarter. I won't bore you with the details. But the identity he's been using is a construction. A good one. 22 years old, deep documentation, professionally maintained." Rourke paused. "I haven't been able to confirm who he actually is yet. But there are certain markers in the financial trail that keep pointing in a direction I'm not comfortable with." Damien turned around. Rourke met his eyes. "I need more time." "How much?" 2 weeks. Maybe less." "Get it done in 1, Damien said. And Rourke, "This conversation doesn't leave this room until I say otherwise. Not a word to anyone on the second floor. Not legal, not finance. No one." Rourke nodded, picked up the folder, and left without another word. Damien stood alone in the office for a long time afterward. He thought about Vanessa, about the precise architectural coldness required to build a manipulation that spanned years, that used real people as components in a design, that had, whether she intended this or not, placed Nyla Brooks into a marriage with a man who had never properly valued what he had. He thought about Nyla. He did that more than he expected to. Nyla was mid-sentence in a resident teaching session when her phone buzzed against the conference table and she saw Vanessa Hale's name on the screen. She stopped talking. The 4 residents around the table exchanged glances. Nyla set the phone face down and finished her sentence about post-operative anticoagulation protocol with the same measured cadence she had been using before. When the session ended 20 minutes later, she waited until the room emptied before she picked the phone back up. There was a text message beneath the missed call notification. "I think we should meet, woman to woman, before things get complicated." Nyla read it twice. Then she opened her contacts, scrolled to Marcus's number, and typed, "Vanessa Hale just contacted me. Don't ask questions yet. I need to think." She put the phone in her coat pocket and went to scrub in for the afternoon. She thought about it for 6 hours. Then she called Vanessa back. They met at a wine bar in the West 50s, the kind of place designed to feel intimate without actually being private. All low lighting and small tables and the soft noise of other people's conversations providing enough cover to say difficult things without being overheard. Nyla arrived first, ordered water, and sat with her back to the wall because she had learned in the years of being married to Damien that it was always better to see the door. Vanessa arrived 7 minutes late. She was beautiful in the way that required significant infrastructure. The hair, the makeup, the clothes, all assembled with the precision of a woman who understood that appearance was a form of argument. She looked at Nyla across the bar with an expression that was warm in its surface texture and calculating in its depth. And Nyla recognized it immediately because she was a diagnostician, and that particular combination was something she had learned to read. Vanessa sat down, ordered wine without looking at the menu, smiled. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said things might get complicated," Nyla said. "I prefer to understand complications in advance." "Straight to it. I appreciate that." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "I wanted to apologize. For the way things were between us when you and Damien were together, I was," a small pause, practiced, "not gracious." Nyla looked at her. "Is that what this is about?" "Partly." "What's the other part?" Vanessa's expression shifted, just slightly. The warmth recalibrated. "I want you to understand that whatever Damien told you about us, about our history, he would have told you his version, which is the version that flatters him. Damien never discussed you with me." A pause. Genuine this time, Nyla thought. The slight disruption of someone who had prepared for a different opening. "Never? Not in any meaningful way. You weren't a significant topic in our marriage." She let that land without emphasis, the way the most effective truths were delivered. "What did you actually want, Vanessa?" Vanessa set her wine glass down. The warmth was gone now, replaced by something more direct and considerably less comfortable to be across a table from. "I want to know what you know," she said. "That's a broad question. About Damien's business, the things you would have had access to in that house." Her voice was steady, controlled. "You were his wife for 3 years. You moved through spaces most people never see. I imagine you're smart enough to have paid attention." Nyla felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "You're asking if I have information you could use," she said. "I'm asking if we have common interests." "We don't." "You haven't heard?" "We don't," Nyla repeated, quietly. "Absolutely. I'm going to be very clear with you, and I'm going to say this once. Whatever you imagine I observed or collected or know, it belongs to me, not to you, not to anyone you represent, and I have no interest in whatever transaction you came here to propose." Vanessa studied her for a long moment. The calculation behind her eyes was working visibly now, running new numbers, adjusting the approach. "He didn't deserve you," she said. The tone had changed again. Softer, almost conspiratorial. Girl to girl, Nyla recognized. The pivot to sisterhood when the business angle failed. "You know that, right? You're too intelligent for what he put you through." "I'm aware of my own worth," Nyla said. "I don't need you to confirm it." She picked up her bag. "If you contact me again," she said, rising from the table, "I'll have my attorney involved before the call ends. Have a good evening." She walked out into the cold street and stood on the sidewalk, breathing carefully, hands steady at her sides. Her heart was doing something complicated, not fear exactly. More like the sensation of standing in an operating theater and realizing mid-procedure that the complication you had prepared for was not the one that was actually developing. That the body on the table had a different problem than the one on the chart. That the next 60 seconds would require a level of precision that left no margin for hesitation. She took out her phone and called Marcus. "She was fishing," she said when he picked up. "She wanted to know what I know about Damien's operations." "What did you tell her?" "Nothing." "Good." "Marcus." She lowered her voice. A couple passed on the sidewalk, and she waited until they were gone. She knew things about the house, about access points. Questions she asked were too specific to be general. She's been watching us, maybe for a while. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Does Damien know? I have no idea what Damien knows. She paused. But someone should tell him, and I'm not sure it should be me. Nyla. I know, she said. I know. She hung up and stood there for another moment in the cold, the city moving around her with its total indifference, and tried to locate the place inside herself where the right answer lived. She was still looking for it when her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Some instinct, clinical, the same one that told her things about patients before the monitors caught up, made her pick up. Dr. Brooks. The voice was male, older, careful in the specific way of someone managing pain. I don't think we've spoken directly before, but you know who I am. Her hand tightened on the phone. She knew the voice. Not from memory. She had never heard it speak. But she knew the breathing pattern, the particular rhythm of someone with a repaired but still stressed cardiovascular system. She had listened to that chest for 11 hours in an operating room 6 weeks ago. Mr. Reeves, she said. A pause. Then, almost quietly, that's not my name. I know, she said. What do you want? To warn you, he said. There's a woman. She's been asking questions about the surgery, about who treated me and what my records might show. Another pause, this one heavier. She doesn't know everything yet, but she's getting close to something that, if it comes out if it comes out through her, it's going to hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt. The sidewalk felt unsteady under Nyla's feet. Why are you calling me instead of handling it yourself? Because I'm trying to do things differently than I have before. The words came out like they cost something. And because you kept my secret when you didn't have to. You operated on me and you kept quiet and you didn't ask for anything. I don't have a lot of experience with that. Nyla closed her eyes briefly. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you to be careful. And a longer pause this time. She could hear him breathing, measured, someone managing more than physical discomfort. If the time comes when you think he should know about me, I'd rather it came from you than from whoever she's working with. He ended the call. Nyla stood on the sidewalk with the dead phone in her hand and the cold night air pressing in from all sides, and something inside her chest that she had been very carefully managing for 6 weeks shifted and cracked open just slightly. She had wanted to leave clean. She had built her exit so carefully. The fellowship application, the attorney, the early morning departure with one suitcase and no confrontations. She had wanted to step out of Damien Cross's life the way you stepped out of a room, quietly, without disrupting the furniture, letting the door close on its own. But rooms didn't always let you leave that way. Sometimes the room caught fire while you were still in the doorway. She called her attorney the next morning before rounds. Then she called the Whitmore Fellowship coordinator in London to ask about accelerating the timeline. Then she stood at the window of her office at Mount Sinai for approximately 4 minutes, looking at the East River, and thought about what it meant to know something and say nothing. She had spent 6 weeks in that particular purgatory, and she understood its geography now. The way it was not really a choice between honesty and silence, but between different kinds of cost. The cost of speaking, the cost of not speaking, the slow accumulation of either. She had told herself she was protecting Damien. Looking at the river, she tried to determine if that was true or if it was more comfortable than the alternative explanation, that she had been protecting herself. From the conversation, from his reaction, from the awful intimacy of delivering news that would unmake a man's history and having to be present for the aftermath. She was a surgeon. She was trained to deliver devastating information without flinching. She did it regularly. She told people they were dying, and she told them the truth about their odds, and she held the weight of those conversations with both hands and didn't put them down. But this was different. This was the man she had loved, or tried to love, or had loved what, past tense, she corrected herself, past tense mattered, in the complicated, frustrated, ultimately exhausting way you loved someone who only partly showed up for the experience. Her office phone rang. She answered it. Dr. Brooks, this is Damien. She said nothing. I know you said to go through the attorneys, he said. I'm not calling about the attorneys. I need a pause. She heard him breathe, the controlled exhale of someone making an effort. I need to ask you something, not as your ex-husband, as someone who, I need information and you may be the only person who has it. Damien, Did you treat a patient 6 weeks before you filed? Private referral, bypass procedure. Man in his late 60s. The river was very bright through the window, the winter sun on the water. Nyla didn't answer immediately. She counted to 3, which was the time it took her to determine that whatever happened next was going to happen regardless of what she said in the next 10 seconds, and that she had 2 choices. She could perform innocence, or she could tell the truth. She was tired of performing things. Yes, she said. The silence on his end was total. You know who he is, Damien said. It wasn't a question. His voice had changed. The controlled register was still there, but something underneath it had fractured. She had heard that particular acoustic quality before, in families, in waiting rooms, in the moment when a person understood that the world had rearranged itself into a shape they hadn't consented to. Damien, where are you right now? My office. Are you alone? Yes? She sat down in her chair. She put her free hand flat on the desk. She took a breath, and she said the thing she had been carrying for 6 weeks in the precise, careful language of a doctor who understood that information was a scalpel and needed to be handled accordingly. She told him, not everything, not the phone call from the night before, not Vanessa at the wine bar, not the notebook or the unsigned weight of everything she had done inside that marriage without acknowledgement. Just the essential, irreducible fact, the patient she had operated on, the evidence she had found in his records, what that evidence suggested, and the conclusion she had been unable to escape. His father was alive. Damien Cross said nothing for 41 seconds. She counted. Then he said very quietly, Does he know that you know who he is? Yes. Did he contact you? She hesitated. 1 second too long. Damien, you need to hear me carefully right now. This situation is more complicated than just, did he contact you? His voice had gone flat. Not cold exactly. Devastated in the way that sometimes presented as cold, because the alternative was a collapse that couldn't happen in a professional setting with a phone in your hand. Last night, she said, he called to warn me. There's a woman, Vanessa, he said. The word dropped between them like something heavy. Nyla closed her eyes. You knew, she said. I found out this morning. Rourke confirmed. He stopped. She heard him breathe again. Ragged this time, just slightly, the first real fracture in the composure. How long have you known about my father? 6 weeks. The silence that followed was different from the others, denser, carrying more weight. You knew, he said slowly, before you filed. You knew and you... I was trying to find the right time. You knew and you left. Damien, you had that information and you made the decision to leave without telling me. The flatness in his voice had sharpened into something else now. Not anger yet. The thing that preceded anger, Ceci. The pure processing shock of betrayal, without any of the heat that would come later to give it shape. For 6 weeks you've been walking around with the fact that my father is alive, and you said nothing. I know how that sounds. Do you? She stopped. She let the silence sit. She could have explained herself. She had the words. The reasoning was sound. The timeline was defensible. Any reasonable person looking at the circumstances would understand why she had hesitated. She could have made the case. She was very good at making cases. But she had just told him the hardest truth of his life, and she was not going to immediately follow it by defending herself. He was owed this moment without her feeling it. So she was quiet. And Damien, on the other end of the line, 63 floors up in the building she had walked out of 4 weeks ago, was quiet too, for a long time. Then he said, I need to think. I know. He stopped again. I'll be in touch. The call ended. Nyla sat in her office with the phone in her hand and the winter light coming through the window and the sound of the hospital moving around her. The PA system, the distant roll of a gurney, someone laughing in the hallway, and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who had finally put down something very heavy. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like the moment after a surgery when you stripped off your gloves and realized the procedure had gone clean, but the patient was still not out of danger, and the next 12 hours would determine everything, and there was nothing more you could do with your hands. 3 floors below, in the cardiac monitoring unit, A 61-year-old former football coach named Gerald Hendricks was sitting up in bed 4 days post-surgery, eating hospital jello with the focused appreciation of a man who understood that being alive was not something to take lightly. His wife was in the chair beside him, reading a magazine. His color was good. His rhythms were stable. When Nyla appeared in the doorway, he looked up and grinned. "Doc," he said, "you look terrible." "I've had a long morning." "Sit down." "I can't. I'm between—" "Sit down," he said again, firmly, in the voice of someone accustomed to managing people larger and more stubborn than himself. "For 5 minutes. The hallway will survive without you." She sat. His wife quietly folded her magazine and made herself unobtrusive in that elegant way that long-married people sometimes developed, the ability to be present and absent simultaneously, to give space without leaving it. Gerald looked at Nyla with clear eyes. "You remember what you told me in the consultation," he said, "when I asked about the odds. Better than the alternative." "Yeah," he nodded. "I've been thinking about that. Because the thing is, that's true of most hard things, right? Doing the hard thing is almost always better than the alternative. It's just the doing is the problem. Getting yourself to actually do it." Nyla looked at him. "Gerald? I'm just making conversation. You're making a point." He shrugged, which pulled slightly at his incision and made him wince. "Maybe both." She was quiet for a moment. The monitoring equipment made its soft, rhythmic sounds. His heart, reliable now in a way it hadn't been 2 weeks ago, moving through its paces with the steadiness of something repaired. "I told someone something difficult this morning," she said. "Something I should have told them weeks ago." "How'd they take it?" "About as well as you'd expect." Gerald nodded slowly. "And you?" She thought about it honestly. "I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something very large," she said, "and I can't tell yet whether I jumped or got pushed." Gerald Hendricks considered this for a moment with the gravity it deserved. His wife turned a page in her magazine without reading it. "Here's the thing about edges," he said finally. "Doesn't matter much how you got there. What matters is what you do on the way down." Nyla stood up, straightened her coat, looked at the monitor one more time out of professional habit. Rhythms good, output normal. And then looked at him. "Get some sleep, Gerald." "You too, Doc." She walked back into the hallway. The PA system called a code 2 floors above her. She was already moving toward the elevator before the announcement finished, her hands steady, her mind clearing itself of everything personal and focusing with surgical precision on whatever came next. Behind her, the door to Gerald Hendricks' room swung gently shut. In front of her, the elevator doors opened, and somewhere across the city, in a corner office 63 floors above Manhattan, Damian Cross was picking up his phone and calling a number he had believed for 22 years was disconnected. It rang twice. Then someone answered. The phone rang twice. Then someone answered. The voice on the other end was quiet. Careful. The measured breathing of a man who had spent 22 years rehearsing for a call that he had simultaneously needed and dreaded with equal force. "Damian," the voice said. One word. Just his name. Spoken with the weight of 2 decades of silence compressed into 4 syllables. And Damian Cross, a man who had ordered the dissolution of billion-dollar partnerships without blinking, who had sat across negotiating tables from people who wanted him destroyed and had outlasted every one of them, felt something in his chest come apart with a slowness that was almost worse than if it had been sudden. He said nothing for a long moment. The office was very quiet around him. The city murmured 63 floors below. The folder Rourke had left was still on the desk. Vanessa's face in grainy surveillance photographs. The whole careful architecture of manipulation that had shaped the last 3 years of his life, sitting there in a manila folder like something that could be filed and cross-referenced and understood through ordinary means. None of this felt ordinary. "You're going to tell me it's complicated," Damian said. A pause. "Yes." "You're going to tell me there were reasons." "There were always reasons." The voice was rougher than Damian remembered it. Age and something else. The particular roughness of a man who had carried guilt the way other people carried weight, in the joints, in the chest, in the sound of his own breathing. Whether they're good enough reasons is a different question. "Where are you?" A hesitation, longer than the others. Damien, where are you right now at this moment? Tell me or I end this call and you never hear from me again. The address came. An apartment in Brooklyn, specific floor, specific unit number, delivered with the resignation of someone who had reached the point where concealment required more energy than he had left. Damien wrote it down. He didn't say anything else. He ended the call, put his jacket on, and walked out of the office without telling anyone where he was going. The building was ordinary in the way that anonymity required. Mid-rise, brick, the kind of place that blended completely into its block because anything distinctive would be a liability. Damien had the cab stop half a block away out of habit, not because he thought he was being followed, but because 20 years of operating at the intersection of legal and illegal enterprise had made certain precautions automatic. He walked the remaining distance with his hands in his pockets, the cold pressing in from all sides. The Brooklyn street running its usual commerce around him without interest. The elevator was slow. He took the stairs. 4th floor, Unit 4C. He stood outside the door for approximately 7 seconds, which was long enough to confirm that he was going to knock and short enough that he couldn't talk himself out of it. He knocked. The door opened. Edward Cross was 68 years old. He was shorter than Damien remembered, but Damien had been 14 the last time he'd seen him, and at 14 every adult was tall, and the memory of a man and the man himself rarely survived the comparison intact. He had Damien's jaw. Damien had never known that before, had never been able to see it in the photographs. The few that survived, the ones Damien had looked at so many times as a teenager that the images had become abstracted, symbols of grief rather than records of a face. Seeing the jaw in person in an old man's face was unexpectedly violent. Edward stepped back from the door. Damien walked in. The apartment was clean and spare, almost aggressively undecorated. No photographs, no personal objects visible. The furniture functional and anonymous. The home of a man who had learned not to accumulate things that could be used to locate him or leverage him or remind him of who he'd been before. A chessboard on the coffee table. 2 cups beside the sink, both clean, a medical kit on the kitchen counter, prescription bottles, a blood pressure monitor, the specific domestic landscape of someone managing a heart that had been repaired but would never be wholly reliable again. Damien stood in the middle of the living room and looked at his father. "Sit down," Edward said. His voice was even. Whatever he was feeling, he had locked it somewhere inaccessible. Damien recognized the mechanism because he had inherited it. "I'd rather stand. Suit yourself." Edward sat in the armchair across from the couch. He moved carefully, the deliberate movement of someone aware of surgical incisions still knitting together. Nyla's work, Damien thought, with a sensation he couldn't cleanly name. "Start talking," Damien said. Edward looked at his hands for a moment, large hands, knuckled, the hands of someone who had done physical work at some point, which didn't match anything Damien thought he knew about this man. The short version, or the one that actually explains anything. "I have time." "All right." Edward looked up. 22 years ago, the organization I was running, not Cross Dominion, that was yours. You built that. But the operation I had at the time, it intersected with some people who had a specific problem, a federal problem, and the resolution of that problem required someone to disappear. "You. Me." He said it flatly. It wasn't optional. The choice was disappear or... He made a small gesture that covered everything the alternative would have meant. "So I disappeared. Documentation arranged. Death certificate filed. The whole construction. And you didn't tell me. You were 14. I was 16 when I stopped believing you were coming back. I was 18 when I took over what you'd left behind and spent 2 years nearly burning it down before I figured out how it worked." Damien's voice was controlled. Absolutely controlled. The effort of keeping it that way was something he could feel in his jaw, in his shoulders, in the particular tension of a man who was choosing precision over feeling because the alternative was not something he could afford in this room. "I was 23 before I built it into something legitimate. I was 36 before I stopped making decisions based on trying to outrun a dead man." Edward Cross said nothing. "You were watching," Damien said. It wasn't a question. The timeline, the financial trail Rourke had mentioned, the way the private referral for the surgery had been arranged, None of that happened without access to information, and access to that information meant proximity. This whole time. Not the whole time. How long? A pause. About 7 years after I heard what you'd built. Something moved in the old man's face, complicated, not quite pride, more like the expression of someone encountering evidence that contradicts a belief they'd maintained for too long. I needed to know you were all right. The word hit Damien somewhere undefended. All right, he repeated. Damien, I buried you. The control cracked slightly, just at the edges. I stood in the rain at an empty grave when I was 14 years old, and I cried until I couldn't breathe, and then I never cried again. Not once. Because I decided that was done. That was finished, and He stopped. His hands were very still at his sides. You don't get to watch from a distance for 7 years and ask if I'm all right. Edward Cross looked at his son with the full weight of 22 years of choices behind his eyes. No, he said quietly. I don't. The apartment was silent. Outside, Brooklyn moved through its afternoon without concern for the conversation happening in 4C. A child shouted somewhere in the building. Traffic on the street below shifted and settled. Damien sat down, not because he wanted to, because his body made the decision independently of whatever he was doing with his emotions, which was essentially nothing. He was placing them in a room, closing the door, and dealing with the structural problem first because that was the only way he knew how to function. Vanessa Hale, he said. Does that name mean anything to you? Edward's expression changed. That was answer enough. Tell me, Damien said. What Edward Cross told his son over the next 40 minutes rearranged several things Damien had believed to be true about his own history. Vanessa Hale was not, as Damien had assumed, a former lover who had maintained a peripheral interest in his life out of attachment or ambition. She was something more deliberate than that, and her connection to events predated her relationship with Damien by several years. She had been introduced to Damien through a social network that Damien now understood had been carefully constructed. The dinner, the mutual connections, the apparently organic development of their involvement, all of it shaped by hands that had understood Damien's psychology well enough to engineer his responses. Those hands had originally belonged to a man connected to the federal operation that had forced Edward's disappearance. The logic was baroque in its construction and simple in its intent. Edward had enemies who had survived and prospered in the 2 decades since his disappearance. Those enemies had watched Damien build Cross Dominion with the specific attention of people who understood that the son of Edward Cross, given enough time and enough success, might eventually start asking questions about his father's death that could lead somewhere inconvenient. The goal had been to install someone close to Damien, close enough to monitor, to influence, to redirect if necessary. Vanessa had been recruited, not coerced. Recruited with genuine incentive by people who understood what she wanted and had offered a pathway to get it. She's been their instrument for 6 years, Edward said. The relationship with you, the orchestration of your marriage, her positioning afterward, all of it designed to keep you looking in directions that don't lead back to certain people. Damien was very still. The arranged marriage, he said. A distraction and a leash. A complicated personal situation keeps a man occupied, keeps him making decisions based on domestic disruption rather than strategic clarity. Edward paused. They didn't expect your wife to be... They underestimated her. Everyone underestimates her, Damien said. He said it without emphasis. A simple statement of fact that landed in the room with more weight than he intended. Edward looked at him carefully. You need to understand something about the current situation. Vanessa has been escalating. Whatever I was protecting by staying hidden, and I'm aware of how that sounds, I am aware, the calculus has changed. She's been making contact with federal contacts, trying to build a case using information she believes she can extract from people close to you. From Nyla. Dr. Brooks was one target, yes. I tried to warn her. I know. Damien stood up again. The sitting had been temporary. His body needed the standing. She told me. There's something else, Edward said. Damien looked at him. About Dr. Brooks. The old man's voice shifted slightly, the careful control acquiring a different quality. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate, The way people spoke when they were carrying information they knew would cause harm and were choosing the manner of delivery with precision. Vanessa doesn't just want information from her. She has been constructing a narrative for the federal contacts that positions Dr. Brooks as complicit. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Complicit in what? Damien said. In the concealment of my survival. In the obstruction of a federal investigation that was technically never closed. Edward met his son's eyes. She operated on me. She knew who I was, and she said nothing. That's the shape of the case Vanessa is building. It's circumstantial, and a competent attorney could dismantle it, but the damage of even an investigation would destroy her career, Damien said. Yes. Her license, the fellowship, everything she's built. Yes. Damien said nothing for a long moment. He was doing something internal that had no visible external expression. He was reorganizing. Taking the landscape of what he'd believed 20 minutes ago and rebuilding it around the new information with the specific cold efficiency of a man who had learned to reconstruct rapidly because survival had required it. Nyla had known about his father for 6 weeks. She had said nothing. He had spent 40 minutes in a cab and on a staircase being furious about that silence, treating it as a betrayal, adding it to the ledger of things he hadn't been told by the woman he'd apparently failed entirely to pay attention to for 3 years. And the reason she hadn't told him, he could see it now with a clarity that was almost physically uncomfortable, was not because she was protecting herself. It was because she was protecting him, because she had understood, with the diagnostic precision of someone who read complex situations the way other people read text, that this information was volatile, that releasing it without understanding the full landscape could cause damage she couldn't calculate in advance. She had been protecting him, while simultaneously building her exit from his life. Both things were true at the same time. He put on his jacket. "Where are you going?" Edward said. "To fix what I broke." He stopped at the door and looked back, the old man in the armchair, with Damien's jaw and 22 years of absence between them. "We're not done. You and I are not done. But that conversation requires more time than I have right now." Edward nodded slowly. "I'll be here." "I know you will," Damien said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite anger. Something in between, the complicated emotional territory of a man who had not yet decided what he felt, but had decided, at minimum, to keep the door open. He left. He called Rourke from the cab. "Vanessa," he said when Rourke picked up. "What's her timeline? How close is she to formalizing whatever she's building with her federal contacts?" A brief pause, Rourke switching gears. "Based on the last intercept, she has a meeting scheduled. 2 days. 2 days. 43 hours, give or take." Damien looked out the cab window. The Brooklyn Bridge was visible in the distance, its cables strung against a white winter sky. "I need everything," he said. "Every piece of documentation you have. The photographs, the financial records, the communication intercepts. All of it packaged in a form that's legally presentable. Can you do that in 24 hours? "I can do it in 12. "Do it in 10. He paused. "And Rourke, Dr. Brooks needs a security detail starting tonight, quietly. She doesn't need to know the specific reason yet. Frame it as routine." A longer pause. "She's going to know it isn't routine." "I know. Do it anyway." He ended the call. The cab moved through traffic, and Damien sat with the particular internal landscape of a man who had just discovered that the floor of his life was false, and was now doing the necessary work of finding out what was underneath it. Some of what he found there was ugly. The emotional neglect of a marriage to a woman who deserved better. The arrogance of a man who had categorized people by their utility without examining whether that categorization said more about him than about them. The way he had signed divorce papers as if they were business documents, and then been surprised when the absence that followed felt different than he'd expected. He had told himself the emptiness of the penthouse was noise, inconvenience, the adjustment period that followed any significant organizational change. He was done telling himself that. He didn't go to see Nyla that night. He wanted to. The impulse was strong enough that he sat in the car outside Mount Sinai for 11 minutes at 7 p.m., watching the staff entrance before he made himself tell the driver to move. Not because he didn't have things to say, because the things he had to say required a different setting than a hospital parking lot at the end of a shift, and because showing up there unannounced, after everything, was the kind of move that looked like urgency and felt like pressure, and she had spent enough time feeling pressure from his direction. He would wait. He would get the documentation in order. He would handle Vanessa first. Then he would talk to Nyla, properly, with the full picture in front of both of them. That was the plan. The plan lasted until 10:47 p.m. when Rourke called. She moved the meeting up, Rourke said, without preamble. Damien sat up in his chair. To when? Tonight? Midnight? There's more. Rourke's voice had an edge to it that Damien had heard approximately 3 times in 11 years, and each time had preceded something that required immediate action. She's not just giving them documentation, Damien. She's giving them a witness, someone who claims to have direct knowledge of the concealment of Edward Cross's survival. Who? A pause. Someone inside the hospital, Rourke said. Someone with access to Dr. Brooks' patient records. The room went very quiet. That's not possible, Damien said. Those records are sealed, private case. The documentation was, someone sold access. Rourke's voice was flat and certain. We don't know who yet, but Vanessa has a copy of the surgical record with your father's real identity flagged, and she has someone willing to testify that Dr. Brooks was informed of the patient's true identity during the procedure. That's a lie. It's a lie that's about to walk into a federal building in 90 minutes. Damien was already standing, already moving. The security detail on Nyla. In place. She's at the hospital, still in the building. Keep her there. He grabbed his jacket. Don't let her leave. Don't. Rourke, I need you to listen carefully. She cannot be on the street tonight. Whatever reason you have to give her, whatever. I hear you. I'm 20 minutes out. Damien. Rourke's voice stopped him at the door. The documentation I have, it's good. It's enough to stop Vanessa's meeting if we get it to the right people in time. But the channel I need to use, it requires you to put certain things on the table that you've kept off it. Information about the operation, about the last 3 years. Things that going public will have consequences for Cross-Dominion that I can't calculate in advance. The hallway outside his office was empty. The city murmured beyond the glass. This was the choice then. The one he'd been moving toward since 4:47 a.m. on the morning Nyla walked out. Destroy the Empire to save the woman who had already chosen to leave it, or protect the Empire and watch the woman who had quietly saved it, in ways he was only now beginning to fully understand, get dismantled by a machine she had never asked to be inside. Damien Cross stood in the hallway of the life he had spent 20 years building. Put it on the table, he said. All of it. You understand what that means? I understand exactly what it means. He was already moving. I'll see you in 20 minutes. He took the elevator down. 63 floors. Somewhere across the city, in a hospital corridor on the 4th floor of Mount Sinai, Nyla Brooks was standing at a nursing station reviewing charts when a man she didn't recognize approached her and said quietly that he was there on behalf of Damien Cross, that she needed to stay inside the building tonight, and that someone would explain everything shortly. She looked at the man. She looked at the charts in her hand. She thought about Gerald Hendricks, 1 floor up, sleeping with a repaired heart in a bed that would eventually discharge him into a future he'd almost lost. She thought about what it meant to stand at the edge of something. She set the charts down. How long? She said. Ma'am? How long do I need to stay? The man looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who had been told to deliver a message and not been given enough information to answer follow-up questions. He said he'd be here in 20 minutes. Nyla nodded once. She picked the charts back up. She was halfway through the 3rd one when her personal cell phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out, expecting Damien or Marcus or another unknown number carrying another piece of the machinery she had stumbled into through the simple act of operating on a man with a false name. The number on the screen was her cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Osei, who had no reason to call Nyla at 10:53 p.m. on a Wednesday. No reason except one. Nyla looked at the number for a long moment. She answered. Nyla, Patricia said. Her voice had the specific, careful quality of a physician who was about to deliver information they had hoped to deliver differently. I've been looking at your most recent imaging results. I know the timing is... Tell me, Nyla said. Patricia told her. The nursing station continued its business around her. Monitors beeped. Someone at the far end of the corridor was pushing a medication cart. The fluorescent lights did what fluorescent lights always did. hummed their indifferent, institutional hum, illuminating everything equally, caring about none of it. Nyla listened. She asked 2 questions. She thanked Patricia and ended the call. She stood at the nursing station with the charts in one hand and the phone in the other, and for the first time in a very long time, in longer than she could precisely calculate, she felt the specific, terrifying sensation of being genuinely afraid. Not for the Empire. Not for Damien. Not for the complicated web of secrets and surveillance and federal timelines that were presumably converging somewhere across the city at this exact moment. For herself. For the body she lived in. The one she had spent her entire career repairing in other people while quietly, without drama, without self-pity, carrying inside her own chest something that had been growing larger on the imaging results with each quarterly scan. She had told no one. She had told absolutely no one. Because she was a surgeon, and surgeons understood statistics. And the statistics said early stage, manageable, excellent prognosis with proper treatment, and she had told herself that she would deal with it on her own timeline, in her own way, without making it anyone else's weight to carry. She had been very good at not making things anyone else's weight to carry. The elevator at the end of the hall opened. Damien Cross walked out. He looked exactly the way she had never let herself imagine he would look. Not the controlled, composed CEO of a billion-dollar operation. Not the emotionally unavailable man who had signed divorce papers without lifting his head. He looked like someone who had run a very long distance and had not quite arrived yet. Like someone who had been doing the urgent math of his own failures and had not finished the calculation. He saw her. He stopped. 20 feet of hospital corridor between them. The nursing station. The fluorescent light. The sound of the building doing the steady, necessary work of keeping people alive. Nyla looked at her ex-husband. She thought about the phone call she had just ended. She thought about everything she was still not telling him. And for the first time since she had placed those divorce papers on his desk at 4:47 in the morning and walked away without looking back, for the first time in all the weeks of careful distance and legal process and rigorous self-protection, she felt the wall she had built with such deliberate, painstaking effort develop a crack. Not because he was there, because she was tired. Because she had just received news that changed the arithmetic of how much time she might have to spend being strong alone, and the person walking toward her across 20 feet of hospital corridor was the one person in the world who had, at some point, been supposed to be the one she didn't have to be strong around. Even if he had never managed to be that, even if she had never let him, Damien stopped 2 feet away from her. He looked at her face. He said, "What happened? Not about Vanessa, not about the federal meeting or the documentation or the Empire or his father. Just what happened?" And Nyla Brooks, who had survived everything alone and intended to keep doing exactly that. Nyla looked at the man she had left and the man she had loved, and the man who had arrived 20 minutes after she'd been asked to stay, who had come running across the city in the middle of the night for reasons she hadn't yet been told. She opened her mouth to say nothing, which was what she always said. What came out instead was 3 words she had not planned. "I need help. I need help." The words hit the fluorescent air between them and stayed there. Damien didn't move, didn't speak. He looked at Nyla's face with the specific attention of a man who had spent 3 years looking past her and was now, for the first time, actually seeing what was in front of him. Her eyes were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about Nyla. Her eyes never gave her away in the ways that other people's did. But there was something underneath the steadiness that he recognized because he had learned to read it in operating rooms and boardrooms, and every high-stakes environment where people performed composure over fear. She was frightened, not of him, not of Vanessa or federal timelines or anything outside her body, of something inside it. "Talk to me," he said. She looked at the nursing station, 2 nurses at the far end, neither paying attention. The corridor was the kind of quiet that hospitals achieved at 11 p.m. Not silence exactly, more like a held breath, the sound of a building managing crisis at reduced volume. "Not here," she said. He followed her to a small consultation room off the main corridor, the kind of room designed to deliver bad news, with 2 chairs and a small table and absolutely nothing on the walls that could distract from whatever needed to be said. She closed the door. She didn't sit down. Neither did he. She told him. She told him the way she told patients things, directly, with clinical precision, without softening the language in ways that distorted the reality. Early-stage cardiomyopathy, identified 8 months ago during a routine self-scan she had performed after noticing irregularities she had initially attributed to stress. Monitored quarterly since. The most recent imaging, which Patricia Osei had just walked her through on the phone, showed progression that moved it from manageable with monitoring to requiring active intervention. She would need a procedure, not immediately, within the next 6 to 8 weeks. The prognosis with treatment was genuinely good. She said this twice, not for his benefit, but because she needed to hear it herself. The statistics were on her side. This was not a death sentence. This was a road with a difficult stretch and a reasonable destination. But she had been walking it alone for 8 months, and the progression meant she could no longer walk it quite as alone as she had intended. When she finished talking, Damian Cross stood in the consultation room with his hands at his sides and did something she had never seen him do in 3 years of marriage. His jaw moved, slightly, the specific muscular shift of someone preventing an expression that was trying to form. His eyes stayed on her face. She watched him process it, watched the information land and rearrange things behind his eyes, watched the man who ran an empire absorb the fact that the woman he had failed to see for 3 years had been managing a cardiac condition while simultaneously managing everything he had left unmanaged, and that she had done all of it without saying a single word. 8 months? He said. Yes. You've known for 8 months. Yes. While you were... He stopped. His hand came up and pressed briefly against his mouth. Down again. While you were managing my medication and reviewing my contracts, and his voice had developed a fracture in it, thin but audible, the kind that appeared in structures under load. You were managing a heart condition while keeping mine beating. That's a more poetic version of it than I would use. Nyla. Damian, I need you to hold it together right now because I cannot... She stopped, took a breath. The breath was not entirely steady, and she knew he heard it. I cannot have this conversation and also manage your reaction to this conversation. I don't have the capacity for both right now. He nodded. One sharp nod. He was visibly doing something internal, compressing, reorganizing, putting the emotional response in the same room she'd spent 3 years watching him lock things into. But this time she could see the effort of it. This time the wall was not entirely opaque. What do you need? He said. I need to know what's happening tonight with Vanessa, because your man downstairs told me to stay in this building, which means there's a timeline I'm not aware of. And if that timeline involves my name and my license, then I need to be in the room when decisions are made. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and called Rourke. Rourke arrived at the hospital 22 minutes later. He came with a laptop and a face like weathered concrete and the specific economy of movement that belonged to people who had learned not to waste anything, including gesture. He set up in the consultation room with the efficiency of someone who had done field briefings in worse locations, opened 3 windows on the screen, and talked without preamble. Vanessa's meeting had been pushed. Not canceled, pushed by 40 minutes, which meant they now had approximately 63 minutes before she walked into a federal building in Lower Manhattan and delivered documentation and a witness statement that would initiate an investigation with Nyla's name in the header. The witness was a hospital administrator named Colin Marsh, mid-level, access to patient records through a legitimate administrative channel. He had been approached by Vanessa's intermediaries 6 weeks ago and had agreed, for financial consideration, to provide confirmation that Dr. Brooks had been made aware of her patient's true identity during the surgical procedure. It was a lie constructed around a truth. The truth, Nyla had learned the patient's real identity. The lie, that the information had been delivered to her as part of the official surgical record rather than discovered afterward through her own diagnostic reading of anomalies she had not been meant to find. The distinction was the difference between complicity and coincidence. Colin Marsh's statement would eliminate that distinction. Can we get to Marsh? Damian said. Marsh is in federal protective custody as of 2 hours ago, Rourke said. Vanessa's people moved fast. He's untouchable through normal channels until after the meeting. So we go around the meeting, Damian said. We go directly to the federal contacts and we present the counter documentation first. That's the play. But, Rourke glanced at Nyla briefly. Professional, assessing. The counter documentation requires context. The context requires explaining why Edward Cross's survival was known to certain people and not reported, which requires putting on the table the nature of certain operations that Cross Dominion has been running for the last 7 years under legal cover. He looked back at Damien. I've packaged it. It's ready. But the moment it goes in, the exposure is real, and it's permanent. Nyla was looking at the laptop screen, at the photographs of Vanessa, at the financial records Rourke had assembled with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that the difference between a document that worked and one that didn't was in the details. There's another way, she said. Both men looked at her. She was still looking at the screen. Her finger moved to one of the open windows. The communication intercepts, strings of text between Vanessa and her contact, dates and timestamps running down the left margin. This exchange, she said, 3 weeks ago. Vanessa is discussing the surgical record. She references the patient by his false name and his real name in the same message. She looked at Rourke, which means whoever leaked the record to her also leaked the flagged identity, which means the leak and the witness are connected to the same source. Marsh, Rourke said. Marsh gave her both, the document and the verbal confirmation. Nyla's voice had changed slightly. She was in diagnostic mode now, the same register she used when she was reading a complex imaging result and following a thread that other people had missed. If Marsh gave her the real identity, then Marsh had access to information that should not have been in the administrative record at all. The surgical documentation I filed listed the patient under his assumed name throughout. The flag on the real identity exists only in a secondary notation in the medical record, which is in a different system than the administrative record that Marsh had access to. Rourke went still. He couldn't have accessed both legitimately, he said slowly. No. Nyla looked at him, which means either he had help from someone with dual system access, or he broke into a system he wasn't authorized for. Either way, she paused. Either way, his testimony is built on evidence he shouldn't have, and the method he used to obtain it is documentable. The room was very quiet for a moment. Rourke opened a fourth window on the laptop and started typing. Fast and without comment, the way people typed when they were moving from analysis to action. Damien was looking at Nyla. She didn't look back at him. She was watching the screen. How long to pull the access logs? She said to Rourke. If I have the right contact at the hospital's IT security department, 20 minutes. I know the head of IT security, Nyla said. I operated on his wife 14 months ago. He answers my calls. She took out her phone. What exactly do you need from the logs? Rourke told her. She dialed. It took 18 minutes, not 20. The access log showed Colin Marsh entering the administrative record system at the timestamps Rourke had identified. They also showed, 37 minutes later, an access attempt on the medical record system, a separate higher security database, using credentials that belonged to Marsh's login, but originated from a device registered to a different user entirely. Someone had lent him their access, or given him their password, or been in the room with him when he did it. Rourke had a name in 4 minutes. The name was a nurse administrator named Terry Cullen, who had worked the floor on the night of Nyla's bypass procedure, who had been on shift when the patient was brought in and processed, who had, as Rourke was now demonstrating through a financial trail that he assembled with almost contemptuous speed, received a wire transfer of $42,000 6 weeks ago from a shell account that traced back through 3 layers of corporate structure to a consulting firm that Vanessa Hale had used as a payment intermediary twice before. She bought 2 people, Damien said. She bought access and testimony, Rourke said. One of each. It's clean construction, except... He stopped typing, looked at the screen. Except the wire transfer used the same routing method as 2 previous payments to different people. And I have documentation of both of those previous payments in the package I've already built. He looked at Damien. It's the same instrument, same financial fingerprint, which means it's not just proof that she bought Cullen. It's proof of a pattern, systematic witness and information procurement. That's a different charge than obstruction. That's conspiracy, Damien said. Several counts of it. Nyla had been standing with her back against the wall during this exchange, arms crossed, watching both men with the expression of someone tracking a procedure that was developing exactly as she had hoped but was not yet complete. How long to package this new information into what you already have? It's already in, Rourke said. He closed the laptop. I need 20 minutes to make 3 phone calls. There's a federal prosecutor I've been cultivating a relationship with for 4 years specifically against the possibility of needing exactly this kind of channel. He answers at midnight if I ask him to. Make the calls, Damien said. Rourke left. The door closed. The consultation room was very quiet. Damien and Nyla stood in it alone for the first time since the hallway. Since she had said 3 words she hadn't planned, and he had walked toward her with the look of a man arriving somewhere he should have arrived years ago. She spoke first. You're going to expose the operations, she said. The things you told Rourke to put on the table. That's going to have consequences for cross-dominion. Yes? For you personally. Probably. You could have found another way, a way that doesn't cost Nyla. He said her name quietly. Without the controlled register, without the corporate weight behind it. Just her name in the voice of a man who was done performing composure. There is no version of this where I choose the company over... He stopped. His jaw worked. There's no version where that's a choice I make. She looked at him. You need to understand something, he said. I've spent the last 6 hours finding out things. About my father, about Vanessa, about what was built around me without my knowledge. He paused. And I've spent the last 3 weeks, since you walked out, finding out things about you, about what you did inside that marriage that I was too... His voice fractured again. He let it. Too occupied with my own operations to notice. She was very still. The contracts, he said, the medication, the night I collapsed and you managed it yourself and never said a word. He took 1 step toward her, not pressure, not demand, the specific distance of someone who is making themselves available rather than making themselves present. You saved my life, and then made my coffee in the morning and didn't mention it. You would have argued about the hospital. I know I would have. I would have been wrong. His eyes didn't leave her face. I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm not going to stand here and list them because that's not what this moment is for, and you've heard enough speeches from men who are cataloging their failures. I just need you to know, that I understand what I had, what I wasted. His voice dropped to something barely above its ordinary register. And I understand if that information is too late to be useful to you. Nyla looked at her ex-husband. She thought about 8 months of quarterly scans, of sitting in Patricia Osei's office alone and nodding at statistics and driving home to her apartment afterward and making tea and not calling anyone. She thought about 3 years of custom medication and late-night contract reviews and a notebook with 43 pages of things she had done in the dark that no one saw. She thought about the morning she had pressed that manila envelope flat on the mahogany desk and stepped into an elevator and told herself that this was what choosing herself looked like. She still believed that. She also believed, looking at him now, that choosing yourself and letting someone else in were not, as she had constructed them, mutually exclusive. She had built the walls so carefully. She had mortared every brick with evidence. She had been so certain that the wall was self-preservation that she had not stopped to examine whether, at some point, it had become something else. Her phone buzzed. Both of them looked at it. Rourke. Prosecutor is on. He needs her on the call. 5 minutes. She showed Damien the screen. He nodded. She opened the door. The phone call with the prosecutor lasted 29 minutes. His name was Harlan Webb, no relation to Marcus, which Nyla noted with the brief, absurd specificity that the mind produced under stress. And he had the voice of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and had reached the point where surprise was no longer available to him as a response to new information. He listened. He asked precise questions. He asked Nyla 3 questions directly, and she answered them with the same directness she used in depositions, which she had done twice before and hated both times, but had been very good at. At the end of the call, he said, I can have someone at her meeting location in 40 minutes. I'll need the full documentation package transmitted in the next 15. Transmitting now, Rourke said. Dr. Brooks. Harlan Webb's voice shifted slightly. Still professional, but carrying a weight that the rest of the call had managed without. You understand that your role in this will require a formal statement, possibly testimony. I understand. And you're prepared for that. I'm a surgeon, Mr. Webb. I've been preparing for difficult procedures my whole career. She paused. I'll be ready. The call ended. Rourke was already transmitting. The laptop screen showed progress bars, files moving through secure channels, the whole carefully assembled package of Vanessa Hale's 6-year construction being delivered to the people with the authority to dismantle it. Damien was standing by the window of the consultation room. There was no view, just the concrete of the hospital's inner courtyard, a loading dock, the mundane infrastructure of a building that kept people alive. And he was watching the progress bars with the particular stillness of a man who had made an irreversible decision and was no longer calculating whether it was right. He had put everything on the table. Cross-Dominion would survive. Rourke had been clear that the exposure, managed correctly through Webb's channel, would result in a structured restructuring rather than a collapse. But the empire as it had existed, the layers and the legal concealment, and the 20 years of carefully maintained ambiguity between the legitimate and the not, all of it was now in motion, changing, becoming something different. He had chosen differently. He was still deciding how he felt about that. Rourke closed the laptop. It's done. Webb's people are moving. Vanessa's meeting will be intercepted before she walks in. He looked at Damien. You should know. She's going to lawyer up immediately. It'll be months before anything formal happens. I know. And the restructuring of the operations is going to require... I know, Rourke. Damien looked at him. I'll be in the office at 8 a.m. We'll start the process. Rourke nodded. He looked briefly at Nyla, a nod that carried more respect than most people's speeches, and left. The door closed. Nyla was sitting down now, in the chair she hadn't taken earlier, the one closest to the door. She sat with her spine straight and her hands in her lap, and the expression of someone who had just completed a procedure and was in the specific post-operative space of assessing the outcome before the adrenaline fully cleared. You should go, she said. It's late. I know. He didn't move. She looked at him. Damien. The procedure, he said. The one you need. 6 to 8 weeks. I have a cardiothoracic team at Columbia Presbyterian who will handle it. Dr. Osei is coordinating. I want to be there. She stopped. Not in the room. Not making decisions. Not... He made a small gesture that acknowledged the history of his own overreach. Just there. In the building. In case you need someone in the building. She looked at her hands. She thought about every time she had sat in a waiting room alone. Every difficult conversation she had driven home from alone. Every cup of tea she had made alone at 10 p.m. in the apartment that was hers now, fully hers, every corner of it belonging only to her, which she valued, she genuinely valued, she had earned that apartment the hard way, but which was, at 11 p.m. on the worst nights, very quiet. I'll think about it, she said. It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was the first honest thing she had said to him that wasn't also a wall. He accepted it without pushing. She watched him do that, watched him receive a non-answer that in the past he would have categorized and filed and never returned to, and instead hold it with something careful, something that looked like the early stages of the patience he should have had 3 years ago. He picked up his jacket. There's a gala, he said. 3 weeks from now. The Whitmore Foundation. I assumed you know about it because of the fellowship. She did know about it. The annual fundraising event associated with the Whitmore Medical Research Fellowship she was scheduled to begin in London. She had been planning to attend. It was a professional obligation, and she had accepted it as such. I'll be there, she said. So will I. He paused at the door. I'll be the one in the back of the room, not approaching you, not making a scene. The corner of his mouth moved, the same brief, crooked movement she had seen that first night at the cardiac research dinner. The one that was more genuine than anything practiced. Just there. He opened the door. Damien, she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the consultation room, the man she had married and left and spent 3 years being quietly indispensable to, and who had spent those 3 years being the one thing she could not fix with her hands. Your father, she said carefully. He's trying. I don't know if that's useful information or not, but he's trying. Damien stood in the doorway. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Too many layers to it, too much history compressed into the expression of a man receiving the smallest possible offering of grace from the direction of an ancient wound. I know, he said. He left. Nyla sat in the empty consultation room for 7 minutes after he walked out. She sat with her hands in her lap, and the fluorescent hum above her, and the quiet industrial sounds of the hospital around her, and she did something she rarely allowed herself. She stopped moving. Not to rest exactly, to assess. To look at the landscape of the last 12 hours and determine, with the same diagnostic honesty she applied to everything else, what she was actually dealing with. She was dealing with the cardiac condition that had progressed and required treatment. That was a fact. She was dealing with a man who had arrived in the middle of the night and put his empire on the table. That was also a fact. She was dealing with a secret that had been kept for 22 years and had just been cracked open, and a woman who had built a 6-year conspiracy and was, as of approximately 40 minutes ago, about to find out that the construction had failed. Those were facts. She was dealing with her own feelings. That was the most complicated fact. She had spent 8 months managing a health condition alone. She had spent 3 years managing a marriage alone. She had spent her entire adult life being very good at managing things alone, and had built, from that competency, an identity so thoroughly self-sufficient that the idea of needing something from another person had come to feel like a structural failure rather than a human reality. She had said, "I need help," to Damien Cross in a hospital corridor at 11 p.m. It had not killed her. That was data worth noting. She stood up, straightened her coat, picked up her phone, and texted Marcus. "It's handled. Call you tomorrow." "I'm okay." She walked back out into the corridor. Gerald Hendricks was 1 floor up, sleeping with his repaired heart. The nursing station was running its quiet commerce. The PA system murmured something in the distance that resolved into a name, a room number, a request. The ongoing ordinary emergency of a hospital at night. Nyla walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the 4th floor, stood in the rising metal box with her reflection in the polished doors, and looked at herself. The coat, the hospital ID clipped to the lapel, the face of a woman who had spent the evening dismantling a conspiracy and receiving medical news and saying true things to her ex-husband, and was still, at the end of all of it, standing. The elevator opened. She walked to her office. She sat at her desk and opened the Whitmore Fellowship confirmation email and read through the details of the London program. The research focus, the timeline, the names of the colleagues she would be working with, the city that was waiting for her on the other side of a procedure, and a gala, and whatever the next 8 weeks would produce. She was going. She was absolutely still going. Nothing that had happened tonight changed that, but something had shifted in the weight of the going, something in the texture of it. The difference between leaving because a door was closed and leaving because you had chosen to walk through a different one. She closed the email. She opened a new document. At the top she typed, "Treatment Timeline and Fellowship Coordination, Draft." She started writing. 3 floors above, Gerald Hendricks shifted in his sleep, his repaired heart doing exactly what it was supposed to do, steady and reliable, and ignorant of everything it had been through to get to this particular moment of ordinary function. In Lower Manhattan, in the lobby of a federal building, a woman in an expensive coat arrived to find people already there who were not supposed to be there. People with credentials and questions, and a documentation package that was apparently considerably more comprehensive than anything she had prepared for. Vanessa Hale stood in the lobby and understood, with the specific clarity of someone watching a very long game reach its conclusion, that she had miscalculated, not the strategy, not the execution. The fundamental variable she had failed to account for. She had spent 6 years watching Damien Cross. She had not watched the woman beside him. Damien's car was 2 blocks from the hospital when his phone lit up with Rourke's number. He answered. "It's done," Rourke said. "Webb's people have her." The witness recanted. Apparently, the moment Marsh understood the full legal exposure of how he accessed those records, he stopped cooperating with Vanessa's team immediately. "Webb says the case against Dr. Brooks is closed before it opened." Damien exhaled. Long, slow. The specific exhale of a man who has been holding something in his chest for hours and is releasing it with the careful control of someone who knows that the release is not the end. "And Cross Dominion," he said, "the restructuring will take months. Some operations will be dissolved, some will be legitimized through a formal process that Webb has outlined. There will be scrutiny." A pause. "But you knew that when you made the call." "I knew that. You did the right thing, Rourke said, plainly, without ceremony. The way Rourke said everything that mattered. Ask me again in 6 months, Damien said. He ended the call. The car moved through the city. Manhattan at midnight. Still alive, always alive, the lights and the motion and the restless noise of a place that had never learned to stop. Damien looked out the window and thought about a phone call he had made to a Brooklyn apartment and a man who had his jaw. He thought about a consultation room and a woman who had said 3 words she hadn't planned. He thought about 22 years of things that had gone wrong in his life and the chain of choices that had produced them. And for the first time, he thought about them not as a fixed landscape that defined him, but as a map of where he had already been. Maps were useful, not because they showed you where you were, because they showed you the distance between where you were and where you needed to go. His phone buzzed one more time, an unknown number, different from the one last night. He answered anyway. Silence for a moment. Then breathing, careful, managed, the specific respiratory pattern of someone with a recently repaired cardiovascular system. I heard it's been handled, Edward Cross said. Who told you? I have sources. A pause. I'm aware that's ironic. Damien looked out the window at the city. Are you all right? Edward said. The question again. The same one from the apartment. Simple and enormous, the way the simplest questions always were when they came from the direction of 22 years of absence. I will be, Damien said. It was the most honest answer he had. Another pause. Longer. I'd like to. Edward stopped. Started again. I would like to have a conversation, when you're ready, about what happened, the real version, not the version I've been carrying alone. His voice was careful in the way that old wounds were careful when they were finally being looked at. I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know the offer is there. Damien looked at the city, at the bridge in the distance, its cables against the dark, at all the lights of all the buildings where all the people were living their complicated, irreducible lives, managing their histories and their choices, and the specific weight of everything they hadn't said to the people they should have said it to. Saturday, Damien said. Brooklyn, 10 a.m. A pause. Then, I'll be there. The call ended. The car pulled up to the penthouse building. Damien got out. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold. The same cold that had pressed against Nyla's face on a November morning when she'd walked out of this building with one suitcase and the absolute dignity of a woman who had made a decision. And he looked up at the building that had been his life for a decade. Then he went inside. Not because it was home, because there was work to do, and the work started now. And for the first time in a very long time, he understood what the work actually was. The elevator rose. 63 floors. At the top, the penthouse was dark and very quiet. He didn't turn on all the lights. He went to the desk, opened his laptop, and began writing 2 letters simultaneously. One to his legal team about the cross-dominion restructuring, and one that was not a legal document at all, that had no recipient yet, that was just words on a screen in the middle of the night, the first draft of something he intended to get right, even if it took him a very long time. Outside, Manhattan kept moving. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, the silence felt different, not empty, like a space being cleared. The restructuring of Cross Dominion Holdings took 4 months, 11 days, and cost Damien Cross approximately 40% of the empire he had spent 2 decades building. He knew the number precisely because Rourke put it in a report, and Damien read the report twice and then set it on his desk and left it there for a week without filing it, which was not something he ordinarily did. He was not ordinarily a man who left things unfiled, but there was something about seeing the number in print, clean, unambiguous, the specific arithmetic of consequence, that he needed to sit with before he could move it to a drawer and continue. 40%. He had made the call. He had put it on the table. He would not pretend the cost was small. 3 of Cross Dominion's subsidiary operations were dissolved entirely. Their assets liquidated through a process that Harlan Webb had structured with enough legal precision to avoid criminal exposure while being transparent enough to satisfy the federal oversight that the restructuring had invited. 2 other operations were converted, genuinely, not cosmetically, into legitimate enterprises that would take years to become profitable and might never fully replace what they had generated in their previous form. The legal fees alone were significant enough to require refinancing. Rourke managed the process without complaint, without commentary beyond what was operationally necessary, and without ever once suggesting that Damien had made the wrong call. He showed up at 8 a.m. every day and worked until the work was done, and occasionally, when Damien was still at his desk at 10 p.m., brought 2 cups of coffee and set one down and said nothing, which was its own form of loyalty. The board was less gracious. 2 members resigned. One filed a formal objection that went nowhere legally, but cost 3 weeks of attorney time and an amount of energy that Damien could not entirely afford. A third board member, a man named Ellison Price, who had been with Cross Dominion since its second year and had known Damien long enough to speak with the specific directness of someone who had earned the right to be blunt, sat across from him in the boardroom one afternoon and said, "I need to understand what happened. Not the legal version. What actually happened?" Damien looked at him. "I made a decision," he said. "You dismantled 20 years of infrastructure to protect a woman who divorced you." "I dismantled 20 years of infrastructure because it was the right thing to do." He paused. "The woman is separate." Price looked at him for a long moment. He was 67, gray-haired, with the eyes of someone who had seen enough of the world's transactions to recognize when one didn't fit the ordinary categories. "Is she?" Price said. Damien didn't answer. Price nodded slowly, stayed on the board, never raised the objection again. Vanessa Hale's legal process moved with the particular grinding slowness of federal proceedings, which meant that for 4 months, Damien received periodic updates from Rourke and Harlan Webb and tried not to think too carefully about the woman who had spent 6 years using real people as instruments in a design built entirely around what she wanted. He had loved her once, or something that had resembled it in the way that certain substitutes resembled the original from a distance and revealed their difference only in proximity. He had been 29 and not yet fully formed, and she had understood his ambitions in a way that felt, at the time, like being seen. He understood now that being understood and being seen were not the same thing. Vanessa understood what he wanted. She had cataloged it with precision and used that knowledge the way a chess player used the layout of pieces. Not to engage with them, but to maneuver around them. What Nyla had done was different. Nyla had looked at him, underneath the want, underneath the ambition, and the control, and the carefully maintained performance of a man who had taught himself not to need anything. And she had seen the actual person living there, and had chosen to stay anyway. He hadn't deserved that. He understood that clearly now. The understanding did not come with absolution. It came with the obligation to do something with it. He wrote the first letter 3 days after the night at the hospital. He did not send it. He wrote the second letter a week later, revised the first, wrote a third that incorporated elements of both. He did not send any of them. He was not trying to be eloquent. He was trying to be honest, which was harder because honesty required him to say things that had no rhetorical cover, no corporate language, no strategic framing, none of the mechanisms he had spent his adult life developing to communicate without exposing the interior. The letters kept failing because he kept reaching for the mechanisms out of habit. He wrote the fourth letter in longhand in a notebook at 2 a.m, 6 weeks after the night at the hospital. He wrote it the way you wrote things when you were too tired to perform, with the specific gracelessness of someone who had run out of better options and was left with the truth as the only available material. He read it back. It was not elegant. It was accurate. He mailed it the next morning before he could decide not to. Nyla received it on a Tuesday. She was in London by then. She had flown out 6 weeks after the hospital night, 2 weeks after her procedure, which had gone cleanly and without complication, handled by her Columbia Presbyterian team with the professionalism she had selected them for. Patricia Osei had been in the building. Marcus Webb had been in the building. Damien had been in the building, in a waiting area on the 3rd floor, in a chair against the wall with his jacket folded in his lap, not approaching anyone, not asking for updates, simply present in the specific way he had promised, as a person in the building, available if needed, making no demands. She had not needed him in the procedural sense. She had known he was there. Those two things coexisted without canceling each other out, which was something she filed away and examined later, in the careful way she examined things that didn't fit her existing frameworks. Recovery had taken 2 weeks, during which she had stayed in her apartment and read 3 books, and allowed Marcus to bring food twice, and her mother to visit once. Her mother, a woman named Dr. Cecile Brooks, who had retired from family medicine the previous year and had the specific emotional directness of someone who had spent 40 years listening to people describe their symptoms in terms that obscured what was actually wrong, sat in Nyla's living room on the fourth day and said, "You look better than I expected." The procedure went well. I know about the procedure. I mean, you look better than I expected emotionally. Cecile set down her tea. She had Nyla's hands, large, capable, built for precision. Something shifted. Nyla looked at her mother. "I said something honest to someone," she said. "It didn't destroy anything." Cecile nodded slowly. "Only took 34 years. 34 years and a cardiac event. Your father needed a kidney stone before he learned to apologize." Cecile picked up her tea again. "Brooks women are efficient by comparison." Nyla laughed. It was the first full laugh since before the hospital night. Genuine, unguarded, arriving without permission. She had forgotten how it felt to make that sound and mean it. She went to London 10 days later. The city received her with the particular gray graciousness of a place that had been receiving people for centuries and had long ago stopped being impressed by anyone's arrival. Nyla found a flat in Bloomsbury, small and bright and full of the kind of crooked old building character that Manhattan architecture rarely bothered with. She could walk to the Whitmore Institute in 18 minutes. She counted on the first day and walked it twice. The fellowship was everything the documentation had promised, and several things it hadn't mentioned. The research was serious, genuinely serious, the kind of work that required her full capacity, that asked questions she didn't yet have the answers to and expected her to build toward them with the rigor that the field demanded. Her colleagues were brilliant in the distributed, occasionally difficult way that brilliant people in research environments tended to be, not performing intelligence, but actually using it, which created a particular texture of interaction that Nyla found both demanding and, for the first time in years, fully engaging. Dr. Elias Carter was among them. He was 41, British, with the unassuming directness of someone who had grown up being the smartest person in most rooms and had found this more isolating than advantageous. He was a cardiac researcher specializing in the genetic components of cardiomyopathy, which meant, in a detail that Nyla found either meaningfully coincidental or simply the universe's commitment to thematic consistency, that his area of expertise overlapped precisely with her own diagnosis. He was the first person at the institute she told, not because she had planned to, because he had been explaining his current research in the small kitchen of the third floor and had referenced a specific anomaly in the imaging of a recent case, and she had said, without calculating the disclosure in advance, "I have that, the same anomaly." He had looked at her, not with pity. She had been braced for pity, and it would have ended the conversation immediately, but with the focused, respectful attention of a scientist encountering relevant data. "How's your management protocol?" he said. "Solid. Post-procedure, 8 weeks clean." "Who's your cardiologist?" She told him. He nodded. They spent 40 minutes in the kitchen discussing her case with the productive directness of two physicians who had mutually agreed to skip the social softening and get to the useful part. By the end of it, something had been established between them. Not friendship yet, more like the recognition of a common frequency. The particular signal two people sent when they operated at the same level of honesty about difficult things. She liked him. She trusted that distinction. Liked, not more than liked, and she was honest with herself about why. Elias Carter was a good man who looked at her with the uncomplicated appreciation of someone who saw exactly what was in front of him and found it impressive. There was no history between them, no complicated emotional architecture. No 3 years of being invisible inside a life she'd built around someone else. What was between them was possible. Whether possible was the same as right was a different question. She did not rush toward an answer. The letter from Damien arrived on a Tuesday morning in her 3rd week, handwritten, which she had not expected. His handwriting was smaller than she would have guessed, controlled, but not the controlled of someone performing neatness. The controlled of someone who had been taught that their natural handwriting was too large, and had spent years adjusting it, with the result that the adjustment was visible if you knew how to look. She poured coffee. She sat at the small table by the Bloomsbury window with the gray London morning outside and read. He did not begin with apology. That was the first thing she noticed. He began with an account, specific, unvarnished, the record of what he now understood about the 3 years of their marriage, Cataloged not to condemn himself, but to demonstrate that he had actually done the accounting, that he wasn't gesturing towards self-awareness, but had sat with the full inventory. He described the night he had collapsed. He described what he now knew she had done. The treatment, the monitoring, the decision to protect the secrecy of his operations at cost to herself. The morning after, when he had asked for coffee and she had made it. He said, "I don't know what kind of man asks for coffee the morning after someone saves his life. I do know I've spent 4 months trying to become a different one." He described his father. Not the 22 years. He said that story was still being told in Saturday morning conversations in a Brooklyn apartment, and that it would take as long as it took. He said, "He's teaching me things I should have learned from him when I was 14. That's not the order things were supposed to happen in. But the order got taken from us, and what's left is what we do with the time that's actually available." He described the restructuring, the 40%. He said it without drama, just the number and the fact of it in a single sentence. "I don't want you to think I'm telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what the decision actually cost, and I don't want to minimize that by not saying it." At the end, he wrote, "I'm not asking you to come back. I understand what you're building there, and I understand that you built it for yourself. And that matters more than I can properly articulate without sounding like I've been practicing the sentence, which I have, but that doesn't make it less true. What I'm asking is smaller than that. I'm asking to remain something in your life, not what I was, something earned, something I'll have to demonstrate through consistent choices over time rather than announce in a letter. I know the difference now between saying a thing and being it. It took me longer than it should have to learn that. The learning is still happening. I'll write again next week if you don't tell me not to." Nyla read the letter once. Then she read it again. She sat with it for a long time. The coffee going cold, the London morning doing what London mornings did, the sounds of the city filtering up through the old building's walls, the particular texture of a life that was genuinely, completely, unambiguously hers. She thought about what it meant to receive this letter. She thought about what it meant to have been the kind of person who had put 43 pages in a notebook and said nothing, and whether that silence had been dignity or whether it had been, at least in part, the decision of a woman who had never fully trusted that being seen was safe. She thought about Elias Carter in the kitchen, discussing cardiomyopathy, with the comfortable directness of someone who didn't need her to be less than she was. She thought about her mother saying only took 34 years and laughing. She thought about Gerald Hendricks eating hospital jello and telling her that what mattered was what you did on the way down. She did not write back that day. She went to the Institute and spent 9 hours doing the work she had come here to do, with the complete focus of someone who had not lost themselves in someone else's life but had found, through the considerable difficulty of the last several months, a clearer map of their own. She wrote back on Thursday. Her letter was shorter than his. She did not match his inventory with her own. She had done that accounting privately, and it was hers, and she was not yet at the point where she was ready to lay it out for someone else to hold. Maybe she would be. The point was that she got to decide the timeline. She wrote, "Write next week. I'll read it. Don't mistake this for a resolution. It isn't one. It's a door left open, which is different, and I need you to understand the difference without me having to explain it every time. I'm well. The research is serious in the way I needed it to be. London is gray and exactly what I wanted. Take care of your heart. I mean that medically and otherwise." And she mailed it on her way to the Institute. She thought about it for approximately 40 minutes during her commute, and then, with the specific discipline of a woman who had learned to manage her own interiority the way she managed everything else, honestly, without excessive mythology, she put it in a drawer in her mind and went to work. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was held in the 3rd month of her fellowship. It was a London event, not New York, the annual rotating location that brought the Foundation's international network into the same room once a year over champagne, and the particular conversation that moved at the intersection of medicine and money. Nyla wore a deep emerald gown that a London dressmaker had made to her measurements, fitted to her body precisely and without apology, the kind of garment that understood what it was dressing and made no attempt to suggest otherwise. She arrived knowing he would be there. He had mentioned it in the 4th letter. Matter of fact, no performance around it. The Foundation invited me as part of the restructured Cross Dominion's philanthropic arm. I'll be there. You don't need to manage that in any way. I just didn't want it to be a surprise. She had appreciated the warning. She had also, though she did not write this in her reply, found herself thinking about it more than she expected to over the following 2 weeks. The ballroom was what these things always were. Beautiful and slightly excessive, the accumulated resources of people who believed in the cause and also enjoyed an occasion to demonstrate that they believed in the cause. Nyla moved through it with the ease of someone who had attended enough of these events to stop being impressed by the architecture and start using the time productively. 3 substantive conversations about cardiac research, 1 introduction that might produce a collaboration worth pursuing, 1 brief and graceful exit from a conversation that had nowhere useful to go. She saw Damien at 40 minutes in. He was near the back of the room, as promised. He was not alone. He was in conversation with 2 men who had the look of people from the restructured Cross-Dominion's legitimate operations, something in the body language of people who were still calibrating to a changed environment. He looked different than he had in the hospital corridor. More settled, in the way that people sometimes looked after making hard decisions and living with them long enough to stop second-guessing the moment of the making. Still the same face, the same controlled physical presence, but the control had a different quality now, less like armor, more like posture. He saw her. He did not cross the room. He raised his glass, the smallest gesture barely visible from across the ballroom, and held her gaze for a moment. Enough to acknowledge, not enough to claim. She nodded once. She turned back to the conversation she was in. But something settled in her chest that had been unsettled for several months. Something that recognized, without requiring resolution, that the man near the back of the room was not the same man who had signed divorce papers without lifting his head, and that she was not the same woman who had pressed a manila envelope flat on mahogany and walked into an elevator alone. That the distance between where they had been and where they were now represented actual travel. The difficult, non-negotiable kind that required moving through things rather than around them. Later in the evening, when the formal program had ended and the room had loosened into smaller clusters, he appeared beside her at the edge of the terrace. She had stepped out for air. London at night, winter cold, the city doing its ancient, accumulated thing beyond the terrace railing. He didn't say anything immediately. Neither did she. They stood with a foot of space between them, and the cold air pressing in, and the city below and the sound of the event continuing inside behind the glass doors. "How's the research?" he said. "Serious?" she said. "Like I told you." "Good serious or difficult serious?" "Both." She looked at the city. "The best things usually are." He nodded. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and the posture of someone who was not performing relaxation, but had actually, over the course of months, arrived somewhere slightly closer to it. "Your father," she said. "We're finding it." A pause. "It's slow. There's a lot of ground to cover, but we're finding it." "Good." "He asks about you." He said it carefully. Not as a manipulation. She would have felt that. She had become very good at feeling that. But as a simple fact offered without agenda. "He says you saved his life twice. Once on the table and once by keeping the secret long enough for it to come out the right way." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure it came out the right way," she said. "I still don't know if the timing was right." "The timing was what it was." He looked at her. "That's what my father says now about a lot of things. The timing was what it was. What matters is what you do with where it lands you." She turned and looked at him directly. He looked back. No performance between them, no strategy. The specific face of a man who had stopped trying to manage the impression he was making and was simply standing in a cold city on a terrace, present to whatever this was. "I'm not ready," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm not ready for whatever the next thing is, and I don't know when I will be, and I can't give you a timeline because I don't have one." "I know. I need you to actually know that, not to say you know, and then, Nyla," his voice was quiet. "I know. I'm writing letters because I want you to know I'm still here, not because I'm waiting for a specific answer. There's a difference." He paused. "I'm learning the differences." She looked at him. The city hummed below them. London, old and indifferent and magnificent, carrying its centuries without apology. "There's someone here," she said. "At the Institute, a colleague." She watched his face as she said it. She owed him honesty, and this was part of it. He's a good person. We're not, it's not, she stopped, started again. I'm telling you because you should know, and because I am not the woman who keeps things to herself anymore. Or I'm trying not to be. He absorbed this. It took a moment. She watched it move through him. The thing that moved through people when they received information they had known intellectually was possible but encountered emotionally for the first time. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked at the city for 3 seconds and then looked back at her. Is he good to you? He said. The question surprised her. Not its content, its directness, the absence of ego in it, the specific priority it revealed. Yes, she said. He nodded, one slow nod. Good. He said it like he meant it, which was not easy and cost something visible. That's good. They stood on the terrace for a while longer. Neither of them filled the silence with anything unnecessary. At some point she went back inside, and he stayed on the terrace for a few minutes before following, and they spent the remainder of the evening in the same room without being in each other's orbit. And at the end of the night she took a car back to Bloomsbury, and he took a car to wherever he was staying, and London received them both into its old, indifferent embrace without opinion. The letters continued. Every week, arriving on Tuesdays with the reliability of something that had been decided and was being enacted without drama. They were not love letters. They were not trying to be. They were correspondence, in the original meaning of the word, one person writing to another with the intention of being known over time rather than understood all at once. He wrote about the restructuring as it progressed, about the Saturday conversations in Brooklyn that were slowly, incrementally, building something that had no existing word for what it was. Not reconciliation exactly, more like the construction of a relationship that should have existed before and was being built for the first time out of materials that included 22 years of wreckage. He wrote about the board and Price, and the 2 members who had resigned and were occasionally missed and more occasionally not. He wrote one week about a night he had stood at the window of the penthouse and realized he was going to sell it. Not because he needed to financially, because the space had been designed for a version of his life that no longer existed, and he did not want to keep living inside the architecture of who he had been. He was looking at a smaller building, something with a garden. Nyla read that letter in her Bloomsbury flat on a Tuesday morning and thought about what it meant that the man who had run an empire from 63 floors above Manhattan was thinking about a garden. She wrote back, "A garden is a good idea. Things that require tending teach you patience, whether you plan on learning it or not." He wrote back, "I'm putting in tomatoes. I have no idea what I'm doing." Rourke thinks it's funny. She laughed. She laughed at a letter from Damien Cross in her Bloomsbury flat at 8 in the morning, with coffee going warm beside her, and London outside the window, and her whole life in front of her, arranged the way she had arranged it, for herself, by herself, belonging entirely to her. She was not lonely. She was not waiting. She was living, fully, presently, with the specific vitality of someone who had come through a difficult year and arrived on the other side changed in ways that could not be entirely catalogued yet, but were clearly, measurably real. Elias Carter had, over the course of 3 months of kitchen conversations and shared research and the occasional dinner that had not been described as a date by either of them, though it had some of the qualities of one, become something she valued without needing to name it precisely. He asked her questions and listened to the answers and never once suggested that she was too much of anything. He made her coffee in the Institute kitchen without asking how she took it because he had paid attention the first time. She valued that. She also wrote to Damien on Thursdays. Both things were true, and she had stopped trying to make them cancel each other out. In Brooklyn, on a Saturday morning in early spring, Edward Cross and his son sat at a small kitchen table with coffee and a chessboard that neither of them was currently using and talked for 3 hours. Edward told him things that rewrote chapters. About the operation, about the decision, about the years that followed and the watching from a distance, and the surgery that had been arranged through intermediaries who didn't know the full picture, and the moment when he had seen Damien's name in a briefing and understood that his son had built something real out of the materials the disappearance had left behind. Damien listened. He asked questions that were sometimes hard and sometimes harder, and let the answers be what they were rather than what he needed them to be. At some point in the 3rd hour, Edward said, "I know I can't give you the years back." "No," Damien said. "I'm not asking you to." "I know you're not." He looked at his father, at the jaw they shared and the hands that were different, and the eyes that were. He had only recently noticed the same specific shade in the same specific light. I'm not asking you to either. They played chess after that. Damien won, which seemed to please his father more than it pleased him. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. Nyla's fellowship produced in its 7th month a research paper that would be published in a journal that mattered to the people who understood why it mattered. The paper was about a specific genetic marker associated with cardiomyopathy progression, her cardiomyopathy, in the genetic sense, the anomaly in her own imaging that had set Elias on the thread that eventually led to a finding that was, in the precise, unperforming language of scientific contribution, significant. She was the lead researcher. She was also, technically, a subject of the research, which she had disclosed in the methodology section with the same plainness she applied to everything she didn't want to have an argument about. When the acceptance came through, she texted Marcus first, then her mother. Then, after a moment, she took out a piece of paper and wrote 3 sentences to Damien in longhand and mailed it that afternoon. The paper was accepted. I am the lead researcher and also technically a subject, which my mother says is characteristic. I wanted you to know because you were in the building. He wrote back within 2 days, which was faster than his usual Tuesday rhythm. I'm having it framed. Don't try to stop me. She did not try to stop him. In the 9th month of the fellowship, on a Wednesday afternoon when London was doing its best impression of genuine spring, the light different, the air carrying something that wasn't quite warm but was no longer committed to cold, Nyla sat on a bench in a small park near the Institute and called her mother. I've been thinking, she said. About what? Cecile said. About next year. The fellowship had a 2nd year. She had already decided to take it. And after. Are you asking me something or thinking out loud? Both, Nyla said. I think both. Cecile was quiet for a moment on the other end, the kind of quiet that thoughtful people used as a response rather than a gap to fill. What does your gut say? She said. Nyla looked at the park, at the trees making their specific spring argument, the insistence of new leaves on old branches, at a woman across the path pushing a pram with the focused efficiency of someone managing multiple things simultaneously. My gut says I'm not done here yet, she said. The research and the city and all of it, I'm not done. Then you're not done. And everything else? She paused. I think everything else is being decided by the choices I make day by day, not by a plan. That's very mature of you, Cecile said. It only took... Don't, Nyla said. Cecile laughed. So did Nyla. The last letter she received that year arrived on a Tuesday in October. It was longer than the others. Not because Damien had decided to make a case, she would have felt that, and there was nothing of that quality in it, but because he had apparently been writing it over the course of several weeks and had only recently felt that it said what he meant. He wrote about the garden. The tomatoes had been a partial success in the manner that first attempts at growing things usually were. Some had thrived, some hadn't, and Rourke had made a specific facial expression when presented with the first successful one that Damien described as the closest to emotional I have ever seen him. He wrote about his father, about a conversation they'd had 3 weeks ago that had lasted past midnight because there had been no good stopping point and they had both been too tired to be guarded by the end of it, which meant it had been, unexpectedly, the most honest conversation he could recall having with anyone. He wrote, He told me that the thing he regretted most wasn't leaving. It was leaving without making sure I knew the difference between being alone because you chose it and being alone because you'd convinced yourself you didn't need anything else. He said I spent 20 years making the same mistake he did. I think he's right. I'm choosing differently. He wrote about the building he had moved into. No garden yet. That had been the tomato building, which had been an interim step. But a place that felt, for the first time in a long time, proportional to his actual life rather than the life he had been performing. At the end he wrote, I'm not going to tell you I've become someone different because that's not how it works, and you're too smart to believe it anyway. I'm the same person with the same flaws and the same inclination toward control that you spent 3 years working around. What's different is that I know it now. I'm working on it in the specific, ongoing, non-dramatic way that things actually get worked on, without announcement. You told me once that the difference between instinct and wishful thinking was experience and honesty. that you had to be willing to know when you were wrong. I was wrong about most of it. I'm being honest about that. I'm building the experience of being better. That's all I have. I'll write next week. D. Nyla read the letter at the small Bloomsbury table. The coffee was hot. The window showed a gray October morning, London doing what it always did, the particular light that had taken her 2 months to stop missing the absence of and 3 more to start genuinely loving. She read it once. She sat with it. Then she took out paper and wrote back, in the handwriting she had stopped trying to make smaller. I know. I can see it in the letters. I'll be in New York for a conference in February. I don't know yet what that means. I'm not deciding in advance. The research is going somewhere important. I'm going somewhere important. Those 2 things are the same sentence. Keep writing. I'll keep reading. The door's still open. I want you to know that I know you've been standing in front of it without pushing. That matters. N. She mailed it. She put on her coat. She walked to the Institute in 18 minutes, the same route she had walked since the first day, through the gray London morning that she had come to know the way you came to know a place that had become genuinely yours, not by dramatic arrival, but by the slow accumulation of ordinary mornings. She was not the woman who had pressed a manila envelope flat on mahogany and walked away. She was also not someone else. She was the same woman, further along the same road, with a clearer view of where the road had been and a less anxious relationship with where it was going. The Institute appeared at the end of the street. She walked through the door. The work was waiting, serious and necessary, and hers, and she went to it with both hands. Outside, London continued its ancient, indifferent business of being exactly what it was. The city that did not care what you had been, only what you chose to do with the morning you were actually in. Nyla Brooks chose the work. She chose herself. She chose the open door. All 3 at once, without apology and without looking back, and for the first time in a very long time, without the particular weight of a woman carrying things alone that were never meant to be carried that way. The door of the Institute closed behind her. The street was quiet. And somewhere across an ocean, in a building that was proportional to an actual life rather than a performed one, a man sat at a table with a notebook and a cup of coffee and began writing a letter on a Tuesday morning, in handwriting that was slowly, with practice, becoming his own. The end.